for joining me live on your Wednesday afternoon. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to make a quick note that 𝗧𝗢𝗪𝗧 Consulting is launching a sustainability desktop audit program, and I will talk a little bit more about this at the end of this session, but you'll be hearing a lot about that throughout the next week as I launch our program and run a competition for 2 businesses to get a free spot in that program. But let's get into what we are here for today, and that's to talk about climate change and whether it is really an emergency. To some of you, this might seem obvious that the answer is yes, but there's still a lot of uncertainty, enough for it to be a problem and something that we should probably talk about, and just to understand, why people believe it's an emergency. What's the science behind it? Because according to the People's Climate Vote, that's one of the largest surveys ever run on climate change, there's still uncertainty. Somewhere around 30% of young people, surprisingly, so 14 to 18-year-olds, are still unsure whether it is a climate emergency, and somewhere around 50% of older people aged over 60, don't believe it may be a climate emergency. So there's not a lot of divide between the age groups, but there's still a sufficient group of people unsure whether this is a state of emergency and something that we need to act on immediately. So I obviously am well aware it's a climate emergency. It's not something that I think, it's something that I'm sure of and I know deep within my heart. And I wanted to talk to you about it today and talk about the less obvious things. So, the way we see it as a climate emergency is that it affects the environment, of course, the habitat, the animals. That's probably the main thing that sort of rallied this space and started us talking about sustainability and climate change and global warming and so on, all the terms that we've used over the years. But some of the less obvious things about why it is a climate emergency and the proof behind it is around health, safety, the economy, society, and the overall depletion of life. So it sometimes isn't as obvious to people that there's a lot of global shifts to as a result of climate change. But even just simply as looking over the last 10 years, we've seen so many more climate events happening and so many more natural disasters. And the pandemic is a really good example of the disease carrying vectors and the results of choices in life and the way we live our lives. It's all centered actually around consumerism and the way that we consume, whether it's food or products or services. We kind of don't really look at the climate impacts of that, but it's really centered around the way we consume. And so there's a lot of science behind this. Science-based proof is very real and strong, and it's no longer any more theories around it. And if you look up the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're a UN body that is looking at the science-related effects of climate change and sort of act as a unbiased authority in this space to help governments to advise them on policy and frameworks and how they might take action. So I wanted to talk to you about the proof. Where's the proof in the pie? What are the outcomes that we're seeing that are clearly related to some of those topics I mentioned earlier? So I'll cover health and safety first, whether it is really a health crisis and a safety concern. So we're already seeing a lot of evidence around health-related impacts from higher temperatures causing, there's some direct correlations and some indirect correlations around the impacts on pregnancy, for example, or diuretic-related diseases or waterborne diseases or vectors and pathogen increases. So essentially more vectors are able to carry viral diseases much more quickly through food and water infections. So the increase in those sort of related diseases is happening a lot more quickly in the last 5 to 10 years. So what they're estimating is that these health-related impacts and threats are actually going to intensify a lot more as the climate is impacted by the way that we choose to live. COVID, again, is a really great example of that, and it's one of the ways we're seeing new diseases and sorry, forgetting my train of thought, but new diseases and conditions emerging as a result of climate-related effects. So the sad reality is that people in countries that are with better health systems or who are wealthier are usually not being impacted as directly. So people in Australia, for example, are not going to be as strongly impacted as, say, people from India. And, I know from seeing it myself firsthand, the lower socioeconomic and the poverty-stricken areas and countries are going to get hit the worst because of, one, where they're located, but also their access to health, safety facilities, the way they're able to respond to emergency situations, even COVID, for example. It's a clear correlation right now. You can see how India is being so adversely affected by the COVID pandemic, and their population is a big reason for that. But also it's their lack of facilities and treatments and access to health solutions. So yeah, the health impacts are huge. And as the air pollutions and allergens and pollen increases through climate change, which I know in Australia, I can give you an example. I live with a partner who has allergens to hay fever. He has pollen allergens. And so there is a direct impact on people who are suffering from this, because there has been probably a 5-fold increase in the amount of people that are being affected by this over the last 2 years even. And we've even had hay fever storms, so to speak, where people have even died from the impacts of the pollen that's been in the air and been resilient in staying in the air and affecting people with this kind of condition. So we're seeing that happen a lot more, and there's an obvious and direct effect on your health and your safety. The safety and the health concerns are very intertwined. They correlate directly with each other. And as there's increase in natural disasters, we're going to see more communities displaced, more people dying and sick, more resources destroyed, and disaster-related diseases spreading, which then, kind of affects obviously the economic situation for the country as well. So that kind of leads me to the next point: is climate change is actually a huge economic disruptor, because as there's more natural disaster and climate-related impacts, we're going to see insurance premiums rise. We've already seen that, and a response to insurance premiums rise and financing situations. So the way that banks and financial institutions give out money is changing dramatically even now. If you've not heard of it before, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is TCFD, they're a framework that a lot of countries are adopting, because it's a framework that helps businesses really be proven to be climate diligent in their decision making. And so if they're being seen as being climate diligent, then they'll get their finance, or then they'll get their insurance approved without any premium increases, because they're responding properly to the potential climate effects. So there's going to be a lot of issues around the economic disruption, and that outwardly, if you see the effects of the natural disaster, it's going to obviously affect supply, demand, production. And so businesses are going to be seen to fail if they don't pivot in time. I like to correlate this back to COVID, because I think that it's a very similar response in terms of how we really need to respond to climate change. As you've seen in COVID, the governments that have responded with proper economic packages have really helped a lot of businesses, but also businesses have needed to pivot if they don't want to be threatened by the loss of revenue, the loss of demand, people being out of work, unemployment increasing, and so on. So huge economic disruptions as a result of climate change. And so the final 2 points, I'm going to sort of bring them together, just sort of around destroying the societal constructs that we've created and depletion of life. So when we're seeing these sort of natural disasters increase, and we're seeing the impacts on people losing jobs and disrupting their business as usual, we're seeing cultural stances change, and without the access that people can have to proper health and jobs to support them through these climate adverse impacts, we're going to see those societal constructs change a lot more. And if we don't change towards a more community-focused way of living, then, and sort of try to stick to what's a very Western way of living, is individualized and separate from each other, then we're not going to be able to really get through this together. And I think, again, COVID is a good example of that, is that we really are all in this together. So, for example, in Melbourne, we are currently in lockdown and under restrictions, and you see a lot of ad campaigns and slogans around that we are in this together, and actually staying apart but still connecting and maintaining our mental health by exercising and talking to people, whether it's video calls or phone calls, whatever it is, staying connected and building each other up and doing this together as a community is really important. And so similarly with climate change, we really need to start looking at this community-focused way of living, which is why I really love these ideas around community housing and tiny house communities and so on. So there's lots of interesting things that are happening in this space, but we really need to start adopting that quickly. So you can see with all of these things that we've talked about that climate change is highly interconnected. The issues will definitely overlap, and the solutions will also overlap. So, often when I think of a problem and I'm trying to solve a problem for a client or even myself in my own life, I always try to take a very holistic view of it. Because if we're not looking at things holistically, then you're not going to know properly whether problem A with solution A is going to impact problem B with solution B. And so when you really map it all out and look at it from a superficial overview and start to then build it back down into more in-depth solution and gap analysis, then we start to really understand what are the impacts of rolling out a particular solution. Because we might say, okay, well, it's really important that we roll out a care package for everybody in this part of the country, but we're not going to know whether that's the right solution, or if we don't really look at it holistically, we're not going to know whether that is an exaggerated solution, essentially, because it might not be needed by everybody in that particular region. It might only be needed by 50% of people in that region. So looking at climate change, and the reason I bring out this rollout idea is because I think that part of climate change is responding to it as we have with COVID, is not just to look at emissions reduction and circular economy and things like that. We need to actually look out for care packages and look out at how we can help people get through the impacts of climate change when they're facing job loss issues or health issues, and how we're going to get them through it. And so I think when we look at it holistically, kind of circling back to that previous point, we're not going to roll it out to everybody just because, or certain percentage of the country just because we think that that's the most affected areas. We're going to roll it out properly to the exact people that need it when we start to look at the problem in its entirety and its complexity. So I think that what I wanted to really lead to is that my view on really responding to climate change properly is to look at it holistically, and if anything, learn from how we have responded to COVID, because COVID arrived at our doorstep and we had to act really quickly, and it was very uncomfortable, but we learned along the way, and we realized that there was a lot of collaboration needed. So that's one thing, is we need to be highly collaborative between individuals, communities, businesses, corporations, academics, peak bodies, governments, everybody. We all need to be highly collaborative. And the second thing is that we need to be open to the change that's going to impact all our areas of life. As I said, it's the way that we consume. So two really key things when we are addressing climate change and thinking about it holistically is be collaborative and be open to the change. And I think it's a really good example to use coronavirus and the way we responded to that as a preface on how we might respond to climate change, because we're not really doing it to the extent that we need to right now. It's happening in pockets of the world, but there really needs to be a combined, holistic, highly collaborative response to climate change, as we have done so with coronavirus. And I really like this particular article that I came across recently from the LA Times. So Emily Gruber is a Georgia alumni who responded on climate change and the correlations to the pandemic, saying that reducing emissions, it's not enough on its own. It's really to provide financial and health relief pathways to the most vulnerable in our communities. And that means proper climate change policies, which might make coal plants obsolete or redundant and many people out of jobs. So how are we going to respond to that? And then major collaborative funding streams as we shift towards more climate-friendly investments is one of the other things that she suggested. So, for example, if you have in the Victorian government, as an example, if you had your, or even the federal Australian government, if you had your education department saying, well, we're going to keep our money separate from the intergovernmental initiative on climate change because we want to focus on education. Well, the reality is that if you're not doing this collaboratively with the rest of the government, then schools are not going to continue running. The supply and the demand for the school system is going to break down as a result of climate change. You're going to see higher levels of absenteeism as more people are impacted, maybe through health impacts or high temperatures causing them to feel incapable of going into school or working their jobs at the school and so on. So the reason I use that as an example is that it's clearly obvious that really in every department there's going to be impacts of climate change on your department, which is why this solution needs to be collaborative and needs to be we need to be all in this together, really. That's my take on this. So I'm going to end this off with a quote that 𝗎𝙪𝙨𝙪𝙮, who was a former energy advisor to the US House Speaker, and he said, climate change will be as bad as coronavirus when we're feeling it, so let's not get to that point. And so that's where I want to end that. I think that that's a really great way to correlate what I've been intertwining this entire time, which is coronavirus. The way we responded is really a good example of how we need to respond to climate change. So thank you so much for joining me on today's FemGineer Chats. I really appreciate it. As you always know, if you have missed any of the other episodes and you're interested in a particular topic, I will link in the YouTube channel where I post my pre-recorded episodes. So last week's episode would have gone up this morning. And finally, to end off, as I mentioned at the start, the Sustainability Desktop Audit is a program that 𝗧𝗢𝗍𝒻 Consulting is launching, and we have a really great deal on offer in the coming week or so. So on the 28th, I will be announcing 2 businesses who are going to be gifted this Sustainability Desktop Analysis program, or audit program, sorry, and they will be working with me directly to enact the program for their business. So I'll be offering 2 free spots, but there is a really great offer in place for those who do miss out on those 2 free spots. But if you are interested and want your business to be put forward for consideration, then I really would like you to reach out and let me know. I'd love to have a chat with you about it and see whether it's suitable for your business. And we are limiting the number of spots, businesses that we allow in, given that I only have so much capacity to lend my time and properly service your business. So please reach out if this is of interest to you. And as I said, even if you miss out on the 2 free spots, highly lucrative offer in place for the same program. So what you will get, it's a 4-part program. I'm going to help you find the opportunity. We'll create a baseline really of where your business is at the moment, and then find those opportunities to reduce energy and resource consumption and essentially do it in an economically beneficial way for your business. So it is a desktop analysis. It is still high level, but it's a 4-part collaborative program. And if you do get in within this particular launch period up until the 31st of July, I will also throw in my measurement and verification tool that I have developed, as well as a training session to understand how to use the tool, so that once you've implemented some of these projects, you can actually see whether the implementation was successful or whether you had a shortfall and didn't actually meet your target, and just to understand why you didn't meet those targets. So yes, please do let me know if this is of interest. I will post the link to the course page have a read about it, but always better to actually reach out to me directly and have a direct chat so I can tell you more about it and yeah, go from there. So once again, thank you so much. Happy Wednesday, and I will talk to you all soon. Take care. Bye.